They are a dynasty in the American art world. Hey there, I'm Jackie Ferris. This week on the 302, we are at the Biggs Museum of American Art checking out a new exhibit, 3 Generations of the Wyeths. We're talking, of course, about NC, Andrew, and Jamie. We're going to talk all about their art and their lives coming up next on the 302. When you say you're a Wyeth fan, you have to be pretty specific because there are so many Wyeths with so much talent. And they are the subject, at least 3 of them, of a new exhibit at the Biggs Museum of American Art. We're going to talk all about it, and we're joined by the curator, Laura Fravel. Laura, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for coming.
Now, we're focusing on NC, Andrew, and Jamie. But let's start with NC. I heard someone describe him as the Spielberg of his time because there weren't any movies, and if you wanted your book or your magazine to sell, this was the guy to go to.
He was one of the best known illustrators of his time, and he was a student of Howard Pyle, who had the first school for illustration in the country, and he set up in Wilmington, Delaware. And so he was probably his best known student and had a national reputation. And so many of the periodicals of the time, Harper's, McCall's, Scribner's, the illustrations came out of this area and then had a national reach. So this really is the visual culture of its day.
Now, when you look at his work, it's so vivid and beautiful and expressive, but he really felt like he wasn't able to live up to his potential. He really wanted to be a fine artist, despite what you see. Can you talk to us a little bit about that inner struggle?
Yes, I think that he's definitely a fine artist. To me, these are very obviously works belonging in a museum, but at the time there was this arbitrary distinction between commercial art and fine art, and he never really crossed that barrier. A lot of illustrations of the time are works on paper or illustration board, which is kind of like cardboard. They're smaller, they're in watercolor. A lot of them were destroyed because they crumble over the years. He went a different route than most illustrators in that he made these very large oil paintings, and then they were reproduced at a scale that is maybe 7 inches tall, so you get a fine amount of detail in that space, but the works themselves stand up over time.
So when he was commissioned to do an illustration for a book or for a periodical, I hear that he wouldn't depict something that was described at length, that he wanted to take you to the point of tension and really kind of add to the story with what he did.
Yes, to me the mark of a good illustrator is that you can flip through the book and get a sense of the whole story without reading a word. And I think a lot of his pictures do have that kind of action to them, that he doesn't get any prescription from publishers about exactly what he has to choose for those scenes. He's looking for moments in the story where the action hasn't resolved yet, and also where the author hasn't listed that many details, so he can let his imagination run wild. We have a couple of paintings in the show where it's not clear if the main characters are going to survive, or they're kind of mid-battle with swords about to clash and you're not sure who's going to win the fight. And those are those really exciting moments in the story before the action resolves.
So let's talk a little bit about the pieces that you've chosen for this amazing exhibit.
Yes. Well, this exhibit, I should mention, is the Wyeths 3 Generations Works from the Bank of America collection. So it is a corporate art collection. This was all collected by Charles Colley at MB&A, based in Wilmington, Delaware. So he was looking for local artists, and the Wyeths were the biggest name locally when he was putting this together. And since that bank was acquired by Bank of America, this show has traveled across the country. It's traveled internationally. It's been to London. This is its first time back in Delaware since it left the bank.
That's amazing.
Yes. So for our audience, some of these people remember seeing these at MB&A. They were former MB&A employees, but it feels like a homecoming for these paintings.
And it's amazing when you look at them, the 3 artists that are featured, the 3 family members, there are so many similarities and yet so many differences.
Yes, there are a lot of big personalities, although incredibly talented family in many ways. And we do keep talking about the big 3, which are NC, Andrew, and Jamie. But we do have works in the show by Henriette Wyeth, by her husband Peter Hurd. There are so many other artists in the family that are not part of the show, and I want to make sure that we give credit to just how many talented Wyeths there are out there.
And there wouldn't be any talented Wyeths if it wasn't for NC and his way of being, having his children be involved in his illustrations. Can you talk about, he is the legacy of this whole family.
He is, and he was a father of 5 children. I get the sense he was a great father, that he'd get up early, he'd make breakfast for everyone, and then he wanted his children to find something productive to do for the day, whether that was playing music, whether that's sketching, painting. Young Andrew would hang around the studio a lot. It must have been so much fun to hang out in NC's studio because he did collect props to use in his painting. He had a costume box, he had a whole library of reference materials when he's thinking about details for firearms or furniture that's period specific or costumes. So just watching that come together must have been fantastic.
And just, teaching so many of his own children and other generations. I mean, his son-in-law, Peter Hurd, was a student of his in egg tempera. What exactly is egg tempera?
Egg tempera is a medium that uses egg yolks, pigment, and a binder. And it lets you build up these very detailed scenes over time with very fine, minute brushstrokes. And that's something that we see Andrew using a lot more too, that Peter did teach it to Andrew. But something that was kind of unique to that moment too, that I don't see that many artists today who use this as a medium.
Now, when you see an exhibit like this, you rarely get to see the behind the scenes, but you have, as part of the NC exhibit, these plates. So can you talk to us about the plates and what they are?
Certainly. We do have in our show kind of a unique room of a commission that transformed over time, that it was originally a few illustrations for Ladies' Home Journal, full-page illustrations of ships at different moments in history. And with those, we have the original zinc printing plates, so each plate would be a different color, and that would get built up over several layers to get that rich detail and color that you see in the final printed illustration. That commission was then turned into a series of murals for a bank in Boston. So we have photos of NC at work on the murals in his studio, using this contraption he rigged up of a movable staircase so he could go up and down this larger canvas. The murals, we have photographs of those in our show. Those are photographs by Margaret Berkwaite that were taken in 1929 on the day of the stock market crash.
Oh, wow.
Which I think explains why, sadly, the murals are no longer with us.
It really is interesting to have all of those artifacts and things to kind of really bring this, narrative about N.C. Wyeth and what he really the seed he planted for his family. It really is remarkable.
It is, and he is so painterly that just seeing these in person has so much more presence and detail than you get when you see the printed illustrations. And a lot of times the figures in the front are richly detailed. Sometimes in the back they'll be a little more impressionistically painted because those details wouldn't reproduce. But we have a painting later in the show, a young Maine fisherman, that was the cover for a book. And you can tell he had fun working on it, that it's a subject that's near and dear to his heart. The family moved back and forth between Chadds Ford in Pennsylvania and their home in Maine. And so many details in that. The basket of fish in the boat, the waves in the background have these wonderful, lively brushstrokes. He incorporated so many hidden colors that there's just kind of a dab of yellow or lavender. Right. And you can tell he's having fun building it up. And I think that comes back also to the local story, that some of these colors were developed by the DuPont company, and the Wyeth family got first crack at them before they were released to the public. So NC has a shade of blue that he uses before anyone else. Jamie later on has a shade of kind of a neon yellow that he gets to use before it's released to the public. And you see that in some of his skies. That's
amazing. So we covered a lot of ground with NC, but when we come back, we're going to talk about Andrew Wyeth. Stay with us.
I'm Jen Bose, the Executive Director of the Greater Wilmington Convention and Visitors Bureau. Watch the 302 to find out all there is to see and do in Greater Wilmington and the Brandywine Valley.
Welcome back. We're talking about the Wyeths, 3 generations at the Biggs Museum of American Art, and we've moved into the section about Andrew. And Laura, let's talk a little bit about if there was an iconic person in the family after NC, it had to be Andrew.
It did, and I think he might have been the most famous artist in the U.S. mid-century.
It really is amazing. And he started very early. His first show was, he was like 20, right?
He was age 20. He had a show at Macbeth Gallery in New York of watercolors. It sold out in 2 days, which is remarkable. And the reviews were astounding that he was called the Winslow Homer of his time, which for a young artist age 20, that set him up for the rest of his career. He never had that struggling artist phase that many go through.
Sure, sure. And so he started with that show in watercolors, but he has a really beautiful painting of a bell that is in oil. So he kind of transitioned, right?
He did. He started off, like most artists do, working in oil. He didn't really take that up later in his career. Started off to doing some illustration, following in his father's footsteps. And we do have one of those illustrations in the show. And I think even early on, it's obvious that that's not where his heart is, that there are so many tiny details in the actual illustration that are never reproduced in the book. So this lovely scene in the snow, and at one point he turns over his brush and he carves into the panel these little footsteps in the snow, which of course are never going to reproduce, but when you're looking at the work, it feels so much more complete. It is a work of art. And I think he kind of carried that sensibility from his father of what makes something feel like art as opposed to an illustration that might get discarded after the publisher uses it.
Absolutely, and his work was so vastly different. Just in the colors themselves, they're more, I don't know how to describe them. There is color there, but there's a sense of, it's a little cold in terms of the feeling.
It is a restricted palette, and one thing we haven't talked about yet is NC does die very abruptly. He's in a car accident with his grandson, his namesake. They are on the train tracks and a train hits them, and that is devastating for the family. And I think even generations later is still resonating with the family that for so many of them who were artists, their art changes abruptly at that moment. I think they're still trying to process that's kind of haunting them. But for Andrew, his palette gets much more restricted, gray. Later in his career, he paints the main landscape a lot, which kind of lends itself to that aesthetic. Jamie, another generation beyond that, has this kind of surreal quality to a lot of his work that I wonder if somehow that legacy is connected.
So when you look at his work, he became obsessed with his neighbors and his subjects, the Kerners, and then Christina Olson, and then ultimately one of the biggest scandals in the art world, was it Helga? Was that her name?
Yes.
Yeah, so talk to me about just his obsession with his subjects.
Well, I think he's always on the lookout for a new composition, and his favorite thing to paint is a scene that is familiar to him, but seeing it in a new way. So for still lives, landscapes, things around his house, he's fascinated with windows, with the changing seasons outside, with trying to notice new details around them.
Yeah.
We have some scenes in the show around his home in Chadds Ford with a millstone in the background, and you see that from every conceivable angle with props for the seasons. For people, there is a level of obsession that I think is rare. Behind us, we have a painting of Anne Call, who was a family friend, but the number of studies that went into creating this temper is extraordinary. This was months of work trying to figure out the final composition, how her head is positioned, what clothing she will wear, that she is kind of a slight woman, but the idea of somebody in an oversized coat standing against the elements, a little anonymous with their head turned away, that it took so much refinement to get to that point where it felt complete.
Sure, sure. I read a couple of things where he moved in with the Kerners and with the Olsons and with an elderly couple later in life, and they would be asleep and they would wake up and he would be sitting there painting them. And
yeah, I've heard those stories too, and I think his friends in his circle got used to him being there, and he would let people know that he wanted them to be a model, so they were kind of expecting it, but still a very personal, trying to see them in their day-to-day, get a sense of their lives. We have a portrait in our show of his granddaughter, Victoria Wyeths, when she is 16. And it looks so simple. It's a watercolor of her sitting in a corner in a black turtleneck. But even that, the the thought process that went into it is so extraordinary, that she went through 2 outfits that he thought were too bright, finding the right spot, that after school when she came home the light was right, the hours that went into sitting in that pose, that it's a labor of love in many ways and an obsession.
And you guys had the opportunity to have her share that information with you when the show opened, is that right?
Yes, she was at our opening and gave a wonderful lecture on her family alongside that opening as well.
That's just amazing to get that extra piece. And that's something that you guys always try to do, is to take visitors beyond the artwork on the walls.
Yes, we always try to find a personal connection and, if possible, a local connection as well, of why this is important to people in Delaware and how they might relate to this as well.
Well, you certainly have done that. So when we return, we're going to talk about Jamie Wyeth. Stay with us.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Way, and I'm a guest curator at Winterthur Museum, Garden and Library, and the fashion on the 302 is phenomenal.
Welcome back. We have come down one story to check out the final of the 3 Wyeths in the 3 generations here at the Biggs Museum. I'm joined, of course, by Laura Fravel, who is the curator. So we're talking about Jamie now, and if it was hard being NC's son, it must have been very difficult being Andrew's son for Jamie.
Well, yes and no. I think being a Wyeth, there is an expectation that you will become part of this artistic legacy, but also a lot of encouragement early on to experiment with new things and try to find your own voice, which is so encouraging for a young artist.
Well, he certainly found his own voice. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between the style between himself and his father and even his grandfather?
All very different personalities. His grandfather, as we saw earlier, was an illustrator, so it's more kind of a visual narrative. Andrew is this very sparse, heavily detailed look at everyday scenes. Jamie, I get the sense that his favorite holiday is Halloween, that he likes those surreal elements. He likes pushing scenes as far as he can. There's so many paintings in our show that have this kind of vivid neon yellow sky, so this surreal quality to them. But he also branches out and paints current events and portraits. He does a few presidential portraits, portraits of friends. And the room we're sitting in now, which is scenes of Maine around his home there. So it is a wide-ranging practice for him.
So you talk about current events. One of the pieces that he did that really is evocative of current events and history and just really tugs on the heartstrings is the piece that he did on 9/11.
Yes, this is right after 9/11, and it is an illustration. It became the whole top half of the front page of the New York Observer, but a painting he did of the first responders, which I think goes back to that Mr. Rogers idea of look to the helpers, that when nothing else makes sense, kind of look at how people are responding and find encouragement and hope in that. And that in our show is paired with another painting he did around that time, which I think is the only painting in our show of Delaware. But he was driving around his home right on the Delaware-Pennsylvania border and saw somebody who had put a full-size flag all along the side of their home, and thought that that was worth capturing, that it felt like it symbolized that moment for him.
And you really can see that his love of all the things that he sees. I mean, behind us is an amazing portrait of an area that he visits frequently. Is that right?
Yes, well, he has a home on this island. Most of these are pictures of Monhegan, a little island about an hour off the Maine coast, that has a big artistic community as well, that he bought a home that had been occupied by Rockwell Kent, that he wanted kind of the artist home in the center of the island. And a few of these you'll see behind me, there's a little barrier island in front of it that protects the harbor. So this was a fishing community. That barrier island gave the fishing boats a safe port to come into. But now it's become more of a summer community of people with vacation homes there. And the painting behind us is actually an interesting transition period between those 2 iterations of the island, that it's a local boy. This is when they still burn trash on the island. So after a phase where they just kind of threw it in the ocean, they realized they had to do something with it. But burning it, but it attracts all the seagulls too when you have that quantity of garbage. And it's so dramatic and bizarre to come around the bend and see this young boy, 11, 12, chucking trash into this furnace, mobbed by seagulls on all fronts. And then that spectacular barrier island in the background. And it's painted almost three-dimensionally, that you see the flames coming out of the furnace, you see sparks flying up in the sky, the seagulls peering out at you. Seagulls have so much personality in many of his paintings.
I think all three of them have done something with seagulls, and bells are common themes. Is that because of the Maine connection, you think?
I think some of that is the Maine connection. That it's hard to be in Maine and not observe seagulls because they are larger-than-life personalities. The bells comes in part from NC's admiration of Winslow Homer, another Maine artist. He had a picture called 8 Bells. NC named the family home after that and the family's boat. And there's a painting upstairs of that boat with young Andrew in the cabin below sketching madly away. 8 bells is a nautical term for kind of all clear, kind of end of the watch. But that's a recurring theme that comes up several times in the family story.
So like his dad, Jamie had his first show around the age of 20, did really well. Can you talk about, his journey and his evolution as an artist? Because, he has become, as you said, one of the big three when you think of the Wyeth family.
Yes, and I think early on there's a sense of celebrity too, and associations with celebrities. So he was friends with Andy Warhol. We have a picture in our show that is actually a copy of something in Warhol's studio. Throughout his life, he did many portraits of Warhol, and then after he passed away, Jamie actually bid on this picture that was in Andy's collection at auction and lost out, and immediately kind of threw up his hands and said, I'll just make my own. So it's a fabulous oversized triptych of a girl with a goat, and the girl is local to Monhegan. She was on the island and could serve as a model. But again, that bright yellow sky where it feels surreal. The whole thing is painted on cardboard, archival cardboard actually, because he wanted it to last, but has this wonderful texture and ridges going all the way down. We have a portrait in our show of Rudolf Nureyev, who was, again, a friend of Jamie's, would come to the house often. And he did dozens of portraits of Rudy throughout his career, trying to figure out his musculature, because he is a ballet dancer, that he does present himself in a certain way. Sure.
Now, when we're going through the exhibit, we would be remiss if we didn't talk about 2 other artists in the family that you're featuring. Henriette, who I personally think is the best of all of the Wyeths, and then her husband, Peter, who grew up in my hometown of Roswell, New Mexico. So tell us a little bit about the pieces that you have representing them.
Yes, for Peter Hurd, we do have, it's a little landscape of their home near Roswell. He was the one who, he studied under NC. He introduced the family to tempera painting, and that was something that he practiced before he met them. Andrew then adopts that as one of his major practices. Falls in love with Henriette while he's studying with NC. The two of them get married. And then there's a little tension where he wants her to move to New Mexico. She's only known Chad's Ford. She sees their life there. But finally she agrees to go, and I think they just flourish there, that her painting style is very different from the rest of the family. It's more ethereal and atmospheric, and she tends to do more personal subjects, still lives, portraits of family members and friends, things that are close to her.
So when we come to see it, make sure you check that out in the back there. But Laura, thank you so much for sharing this with us. It really has been a pleasure.
Thank you, and I hope that you will all come see the Wyeths 3 Generations, works from the Bank of America collection at the Biggs, and I am pleased to announce too that the show has been extended through February 19th.
Well, fantastic. You heard it here first. Be here before the 19th of February. We'll be right back. Are you enjoying all of the artwork from Andy, NC, and Jamie? Well, if you visit the Biggs Museum, make sure you snap a picture and share it with us on Facebook. Now, here are a couple of other things you might want to check out. You know, the folks here at the Big say many people have Wyeth connections and come here and share them with them, and they love that. So if you come, make sure you share your Wyeth connection. For more information on any of the exhibits here at the Bigs, visit bigsmuseum.org. That'll do it for this week's episode of the 302. We're going to leave you now with beauty shots from Cool Springs Park in Wilmington. Until next time, I'm Jackie Ferris. Tell them you saw it on the 302.